Welcome back to Next Level Rides. In this video, as we're nearing the end of this project, we're going to be rebuilding the rear brake caliper as it was leaking pretty badly. So what we're going to do is we're going to fully disassemble the caliper itself to fully inspect it and then end up rebuilding it, trying to figure out exactly what we need, whether it's O-rings, seals, and then eventually give it a quick paint job with a nice red paint and put it back together. Next up, don't do what I did and put 200 psi to the back of the piston. It'll end up sending it into outer space. It felt like my life flashed before my eyes. The piston ended up popping out. It hit the wall in front of me and then it whizzed past my head and up and over the 5 Series right in behind me. It was a pretty scary endeavor, but you know what? We live fast and die hard apparently. So next up, what we're going to do is we're going to end up prepping the calipers for painting. We start by wiping them down with acetone, and then we take a little brush and we start to brush them on. We do one light layer at first, and then the second layer after it skims over, we would end up putting a thicker layer. After we leave it for a couple of days just to ensure it cures, because it does have enamel in it, it'll be ready for reassembly and to be put back onto the cart. After we leave the caliper to cure, we start by reassembling the cart itself. And next, we'll end up putting the side stanchions on. Not sure exactly what they're called, but they end up holding the side fenders on. Once those are all tightened up, we'll end up starting by putting the seat back in. That's held in with a bunch of Allen bolts and 14mm nuts from the underneath. Following that, we end up doing the side engine cover. And now that the caliper has had a few days to dry, we will start the reassembly. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to reassemble the caliper. So I've pre-lubed these with just silicone lubricant, some of that. So be a little bit generous with the lubricant. Okay. So we'll get that one in flat. So the cup goes on the back side where the brake fluid would end up being. And on this side, once it's all lubed up, you just push this in nice and carefully. And actually, you should probably push it in. It'll eventually bottom out. I can hear all the air escaping. So that's half of it. All right, the other half, same thing. So there's open side, closed side. Holy, it keeps slipping away. Okay, there we go. Yeah, it feels good. Let's start like this. I'll hold it in place a little bit nicer. Yeah, so now I'm just going to look up and around. Now the most important parts would be this surface right here, so you can see it's a bit uneven. So this is where the brake pads, or the end of the brake pads, end up sitting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen it off just a hair. Actually, let's just use it by hand now. So we're just going to aim to have it flat. Yeah, that's decent. Flip it over. Give it a little bit more torque. Not anything super crazy. Okay. So it's starting to look like a caliper again. So next up, what we're going to do is we're going to prep the brake pads and the shims. So I'm just going to give it a little thing there, a little thing here, a little thing here. Right where the piston meets the back of the brake pad, put a little bit there, a little bit on the shim because the shim will actually contact the back of the brake pad, a little bit over here, just so it doesn't seize up. So because there's the grease on there now, this will actually hold it in place when we go to install it. And since I have 3 of these, not sure why there was 2 on one side. Again, I'm not here to reinvent the wheel, but at the same time, when something doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. Right. So all I did with the brake pads is I took my orbital sander with, I think, a 60 or an 80 grit, and I had it spinning as I put the brake pad, gave it a couple little wiggles. Same thing for the shims. It actually turned out surprisingly good. So initially what I was going to do is put a mirror down because the mirror will end up being super flat. You tape sandpaper to it, and then you just manually by hand. But that was fine. I mean, this is going to be more than enough. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to hang the brake pads so you can see how it holds it in place, which is nice. So this is what ends up holding them. So I'm just trying to figure out which side's left, which side's right. Not that I think it matters all that much. Come on. Come on. So this bolt kind of works as a guide to keep the brake pads kind of in place. So we'll do the same thing. There we go. Okay, so that's just kind of hanging the brake pads. So on the end, there's a cotter pin. Yep, there it is. So a little cotter pin actually holds the bolt in place. So all this does is it just gives the brake pads just a little bit of support. All right, next up we have these little shims here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the brake pads kind of away from one another. I'm going to act as if they're fighting right now. So let me get a little bit cheeky, and we're just going to put something in the middle just to kind of hold them in place. So what we're doing here, if it shows on the camera, is each of these shims. Now, I'm not sure if these are going to be, we're supposed to be lubricated, so let's put a tiny bit of lubrication on them. It's because they're sliding into the caliper. There's two, three. Okay. So hopefully I remember exactly how this goes back together. So next up would be these little metric bolts. So the neat thing about this is, and the reason I have this here is the back of the brake pad is actually threaded, which is kind of interesting. So what we're going to do is we're just going to thread this in. Now these, pretty sure this is just to keep the brake pad centered. So I'll thread them in nice by hand, and I'll get a ratchet. It's always the last one that fights you too, hey? Oh, okay. I kind of see what's going on here. So the little sleeves that I had put in, it actually keeps the shim centered. Okay. 2, 3, 4. So the importance of lubing this up is that if by chance it gets a little bit wet, you don't need to worry about it rusting, corroding, or end up seizing, which should be good. Okay, I should be able to remove this now. Yeah, I guess you can touch the other brake pad. You ain't going nowhere now. Okay. 1, 2, spin it around. 3, 4. So right here you can see there's a tiny little O-ring. So these are the bleeder screw. And as these calipers are dual piston, which is actually pretty neat. All we need to do is tighten that one there. Okay. We're not going to tighten those super tight. And that, for the most part, is it. That's a caliper put back into place. So as the brake pads move, these little slider pins will actually move. So it's probably a good thing that we lubed them up. In turn, there's a little bit of grease or the silicone lubricant on those. Relatively easy to service, it looks like. If by chance these get a little bit stuck, you could probably put a little bit of WD-40 in that, or just pull them out and lube them up again. Okay, so it's time to install it on the go-kart. But we have a bolt left over. You didn't see that. Okay, so I want to put the brake caliper on. So slide it right here, slide it into place. And come on, bolt 1. And the second bolt. This is the epitome of you gotta do what you gotta do. I don't like it, but the bolt's a little bit long. It's mismatched. I had to put a nut in the middle of it just so it would actually work. And with this, we're gonna put a spacer on the other side so it's not gonna flex the seat too much. And you know what? Thread it in. So I tried to clean the bolts up a little bit. I put some anti-seize on them. So this should go in relatively easy. without bottoming out this time. So far so good there. What is this? 13. I'm not using that peasant 13. Let's get a ratcheting one. All right, it's dead straight. Once you start to tighten up, it's gonna snug. Yep, feels pretty good. So what we're trying to do is right in between here is have the gap equal on both sides. Now, as long as there's no drag on the brakes, should be okay. So I'm gonna stick my fat head in there. It's okay there. Yep. So if you watched the first video, you'll actually be able to remember that I had a really tough time spinning this as the brakes were all seized up. So there was no more lubricant on it. It was seized. Couldn't really do a whole heck of a lot with it. So all we did is we just gave it a quick clean, give the brake pads a good clean, and you know what, this will be all right. If I start getting a little more competitive with karting, I'll probably just replace the pads. And as this is a two-piece disc, so a floating disc, I guess they would call it, I'll probably replace the both of them, get new tires and stuff. But for what we're looking to do with it, this will be perfectly fine. All right, I'll snug it up. And again, if I haven't already stressed it enough, make sure everything is anti-seized, because if this gets grit and corrosion, the last thing I want to do is fight with it, taking it apart. For the most part, this is all aluminum, so the last thing I want to do is strip it. All right, give the brake line a little clean. It's so clean, it squeaks. We're gonna thread it through the frame and get it started on the back of the caliper. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of the orientation. They're not completely symmetrical on the caliper. Does it matter? Absolutely not. But as you will learn, the more videos you watch, I am pretty OCD and can't accept things like that, and everything needs to be as good as it can be. All right. So you don't want to put any lubricant or anything on these. They bottom out, give them a snug. That's all you need to do. For this back one, let's see if I can maybe squish my hand in there. Excuse the view. This isn't ideal, but this is what I was talking about. You can see this one has more of a downward gradient, whereas that one sticks up. So I'm just gonna turn it a little bit. All right, let's just give it a little turn. That's pretty close. Let's see, it might be a little bit more than the other one. Okay. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use probably 2 P-clips. P-clip and a zip tie to keep this nice and rigid. P-clip here. That way it's not gonna rub on the frame or anything. So I sprayed this out with brake clean, so it should be pretty clean. Put it onto the master cylinder now. So we haven't taken apart the master cylinder yet. So I need to figure out what's going on here. Now, obviously this isn't a vacuum assisted, or I don't know what they call it, power brake system, whatever the hell. It's gonna be just reservoir. I know there's a diaphragm in here. So in the bottom of it, it actually has, I think it's an Allen number 8 that holds this whole reservoir into here. So I need to figure out if I bleed the reservoir through here, or if I need to take this whole thing out and pre-fill it. I don't know, I hate dealing with brakes, but don't have much of a choice here. Nice. Okay, so I did take it apart. So the reservoir here has a little hole, and then it's, I believe it's a H7. So the H7 goes through there, screws into the reservoir, or starting into the reservoir, screws into the master cylinder, and then you pour fluid right over top. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna replace this. I'm gonna crack the lines on the back of the caliper, and I'm just gonna continuously fill this until I bleed the rear brake. Shouldn't be too bad. So on here, there's a little O-ring. I don't know if you can see it. So I made sure everything was nice and cleaned up. I want it to seal properly. There we go. So once I fill this up, I'll spray it all down with brake clean. It's like a little sippy cup. Perfect for a short espresso on this Italian go-kart. So this, I'm not completely certain on the torque spec. I think as long as it seals enough to hold fluid, it's fine. And then for here, only because I'm going to put the cap back on quick. So it has a little diaphragm, okay? So I could push this out. So it kind of has, like as you Press on the pedal and imagine the vacuum inside here will end up pulling it down. Oh, okay, it's two-piece, great. So there's the plastic frame, and it looks like just a membrane. So my understanding is you don't want it to be in any orientation other than this. So give it a little wipe, put that back right on top. Okay, so I'm just gonna put the cap back on because I don't have DOT 5.1 fluid right now. I'm just gonna head off to the store, grab some specific racing brake fluid. Like everything here looks pretty good. I'll probably grab some grip tape just for here because this is, I'm sure once upon a time it used to be grippy, now it's smooth, so no good. Okay, so I kind of figured something wasn't quite right when I installed the brake caliper here. I didn't think that the brake pads should float on their own. So what I ended up doing is I ended up looking at a bit of a schematic, whichever one I could end up finding in English, because everything's in, for the most part, Italian. So I figured I'd give this a shot. See if I could find the right one. The biggest issue that I foresee with this route is that I don't know what the tension would be on the springs that were in this. I don't know if they're super aggressive. I don't know if they're relatively light. Not completely sure. So all I've really found that could work here. I think these are a little bit short, and I found that these are actually not very resistant. So what my plan is to take this. I'm going to put the one spring over top of it because it's the appropriate diameter. And the second spring, I don't know if it's going to show up, but you can see where the spring flattens out and it ends right there. I'm going to take the second spring and turn it just so it interlocks like that. And fandangle the brake pad so it actually connects. Now, I don't think this is going to end up being a permanent solution. And what I would like to do, just because the springs are relatively thin, is I might actually try and find, right at the bottom here, a washer that's going to end up taking a little bit of that gap there. But you can actually see how now it's actually pushing the caliper back. Actually, you know what? That's a fair bit of tension. So with the brake fluid pressure, when you apply the brakes, because again, it's going to be a manual setup, it'll push out and it'll be greater than the tension of the spring to actually press against the caliper. And once you let go, springs pull it back into place. You know, I think that's actually pretty good. So yeah, I'm going to find some washers. I'm going to find enough springs, and I'm just going to get the 4 of them done and throw it back in the cart. Okay, so since I'm a certified Get-A mechanic, you saw in the previous clip where the negative had popped off and it started sparking, and I basically called it there. Didn't want to deal with it anymore. In turn, when this actually popped off, the positive actually ripped off as well. So there's a connector here, and it ended up pulling off, and when it broke, it ended up ripping the connector right off. So there's only a few wire strands that were actually left inside here. So I don't recommend doing this at home, but this is the fix that I did. With the wire strands, I figured I'd find a bolt big enough to displace the wires. When I ended up cutting back the electrical tape that was on here, I found that there was actually an eyelet. So all I did for here is I took the bolt and I ended up twisting it through the wires, and it's relatively snug. Like, there's a tiny bit of flex if you're really hard on it, but you know what? It ain't stupid if it works. So the starter's fixed, and we'll give it another shot. So one other thing I noticed is there's a bit of an issue when I put the carburetor back on. I ended up putting the linkage in and took a peek at the blade, and it was a little bit like this. So when I put the cable back on, you can see that the throttle body was actually, or the blade was actually cracked open. So when I put it back together, and this is the factory settings that it had prior, so when you look in there, the blade was open. So what I did is I ended up doing the adjustment here. So you can see there's one 10 mil nut here, one 10 mil nut there. So I adjusted them enough to actually close the throttle body, which gave it the full range of movement. Now that being said, when I ended up depressing the throttle here, it would only crack open so much. So what I did is I took a bungee cord and I wrapped it around the throttle just to see, and I actually noticed if you manually adjust the carburetor itself, it would actually crack open another probably 30%. So it's pretty significant. So obviously something I needed to fix. So once this was all set, I looked down here and there was another adjustment screw. Now this here will pull a little bit more tension on the cable itself. So I adjusted this to take the slack out. So before I actually noticed that the wire was resting on the frame, and it was significantly better. So to take the additional slack out, I went right here and you can see that there's a 10 mil head, 10 mil nut, and 10 mil nut on there. So what I did is I ended up adjusting this enough to fully depress the throttle. So again, when I ended up pinning this with the cable tie here, you can actually see as I'm holding the throttle that the throttle body is wide open. So if I try to manipulate it further, it doesn't go any further. So now we have the full range of movement for the carburetor, and I bet you that would be the idling issue. With the blade being cracked open, I bet you now we get a little bit nicer drivability with the cart. I'd be willing to bet that it will idle now because it does have a clutch on it. When I had it started even temporarily, the RPMs were through the roof. So between rebuilding the carburetor, between now properly adjusting the carburetor, of course I'll adjust it as soon as I get it running, but also adjusting the linkage of the throttle body, I think it's actually going to run pretty good, and I think it's going to be pretty surprising. So I'll continue on and get this thing back together and see how it is. So what we're going to try to do is, now that these tires are nicely studded, so this is the outer edge, and I believe I marked it right, guessing that says rear left. Okay, so it has to go down like this. So I cleaned up the bead on here. Now, the tricky part is I'm going to try and mount these by hand, which is going to suck. I figured I'd try to do myself a favor and get some super soapy water. Spray a little bit of soap from the inside. Now, they should, with a little effort, roll on, but I don't think this is going to work out for me very well. Hey, that wasn't so bad. So from what I understand, you want to kind of push down the one edge and then massage it around. Well, R.I.P. flathead. Oh. I'm gonna buy tools to do this. What a pain in the ass. Alright, now that we fought for a good 45 minutes to get the tires back on, fill the compressor, make a big mess so you have no room to work. And we'll see if we can get it seated. So you want the bead to be even all around for it to pop on. So like a regular conventional tire, as soon as you put air to it, it should inflate. These don't take a whole lot of air. So let's give it a shot. From what I gather, should fill? Yes, look at that. Okay, so you gotta be very careful not to catch your finger in the bead. But as you can see, you know what? It's actually seated. It's equal all the way around. It's holding PSI. Okay, so we'll put 30 to this one. We'll put it aside. What we're gonna do is we're gonna clean them up and we're gonna monitor them to see if they're gonna leak at all. Rinse and repeat for the rest of the tires. It was a little bit of a pain in the ass because I needed to manhandle the tires on, but at the end it really wasn't so bad. The tires were just old, so it took some time and a little bit of effort, but we got it done. Here I'm replacing the fenders on the side of the cart itself. I needed to ensure the studs weren't going to interfere, so what I had to do is drill new holes and slide the fender forward about a ½ inch.
The next day.
On this installment of It's Not Stupid If It Works, ghetto tuning the carburetor. So we have the cart on the ground here, and what we did is we ended up putting some of the matting that I use for lawn chairs in the summertime against the wall. It's cracked, and I used I think it was a 6-inch by 8-foot aluminum pipe. bungee wrapped it right over the muffler. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna try and get this thing started, tune the carb, and see how it goes. So I'm just recording this quick on the phone. So it was having fueling issues. So what I noticed is when I pulled this out, the top was tight, but if you look right here, see the bottom hose? How it's just slipping right out? So I'm gonna have to figure something out because it doesn't quite fit into here if I put a worm clamp or something on it. So I might need to find some sort of a crimp or maybe smaller diameter for the hose. But basically what would end up happening is the carb itself would pull, I believe pop-off pressure when I tested it was 10 PSI and it would hold at 8. So it would always pull air in from this hose, and sure enough, path of least resistance, it sucked air right past the fitting. Go figure. That was the issue the whole time. Alrighty, so the solution here, I ended up using smaller internal diameter hose. So you can see here, this one is a little bit bigger. And then this one is a little bit smaller. Actually, on the camera, it's actually looking noticeably smaller. So I'll chuck that to the side. So what I did is I ended up heating up the hose here, and I ended up put a little bit of spit on the end of the barb, shove it on there. I did the same for the opposite side. So right here. So I'm going to try and get it down a little bit further. But what I did is I, again, warmed up the hose, pushed it on the end of the barb, and because this was curled, I put it in the vise, clamped it down, and I held it straight up as I heated up the hose with a heat gun, just to make it a little more flimsy. So it ends up sitting in the tank like that. So the weight will hold it down. It'll get to the sump of the tank. And if you can see, right around here. So what I did is I put some zip ties around just on the edge of the barbs for it to hold on tight. I heated up with a heat gun, pulled them down, and I'm just leaving them on until the hosing actually cures. So what it'll do is it'll make 2 indents here, and I really don't think it's gonna leak afterwards. The factory piece ends up using an O-ring up here and some sort of sleeve and a hose and whatever. I don't have any of that, so I'm just gonna use some ghetto ingenuity. It'll be good. Okay, so another thing I ended up doing is the tack right here. It has an internal battery, and this one is pretty old. So because this one doesn't work anymore, I ended up getting another one off Amazon. It's just a cheap $25 one by Run Leader, sure. Difference being the one that it originally had was a quartz screen, and this is an LCD screen. So this one will be green, and it's actually going to show me the accurate RPM, and I can set an RPM limit. So once it hits the 18,000 or 18,500, hey, stop falling over. Once it hits that, the screen will actually go from green to red, which is nice. So I ended up running the wire all the way down under the air box to here, up and over. And what you do, because this is an induction powered tack, I think that's what they call them. So right at the end of the spark plug boot, you'll see these ribs. So I have the wire going up here. Now it says you need to make 4 to 5 coils for an accurate RPM reading. So you make it all the way to the end and you tighten it. You go 4 or 5 coils. I put a zip tie on the end and then a ring of electrical tape as I followed it down. So it's actually really, really taut. You can't tell that it's a spring and or that it's a wire and it's not going to move. So this will actually give us the RPM reading. So make sure it's nice and tight, follow it up and down. And then the new run leader one will actually have an internal battery. So you can actually see it right in the back. So I'll get rid of the wiring up there. I'll fix it up and it'll be better. So it won't be that big a deal. It's actually coming together. Figured out what the problem was with the fueling and see if it works. As you can see, the kart's actually doing really well. So a little bit of fine tuning and that's all it really needs. Next up, we're gonna end up taking the kart for a fun adventure on some ice. So stay tuned, feel free to like and subscribe. See you guys in the next one.